The Japanese Zero fighter had Lieutenant Danny "Lucky" O'Sullivan locked in its gun sights when the 1943 penny in his breast pocket, the one his grandfather had given him before shipping out to the Pacific, caught a glint of morning sunlight and reflected it directly into the Japanese pilot's eyes at exactly the moment he squeezed the trigger. The 20mm cannon rounds that should have torn through Danny's P-38 Lightning cockpit instead went wide by 6 inches, missing his fuel tank by the narrowest margin possible while Danny rolled his fighter into a diving spiral that would either save his life or send him straight into the blue waters of the Solomon Sea. But this wasn't just about a lucky reflection or a well-timed evasive maneuver. This was about a family tradition that stretched back 3 generations, a penny that had survived World War I in his grandfather's pocket, the Great Depression in his father's wallet, and was now flying through the deadliest air combat of World War II in Danny's flight suit. The same penny that had supposedly saved his grandfather Patrick O'Sullivan from German machine gun fire at Belleau Wood, and his father Michael from a factory accident that should have killed him in 1934. What happened next would prove that sometimes luck is just preparation meeting opportunity, and that family traditions can carry more power than superstition when they're backed up by skill, courage, and the desperate need to get home alive to the people who are counting on your survival. If stories of family legacy and impossible survival move you, hit that subscribe button. These accounts show what happens when tradition meets split-second timing and proves that sometimes the smallest things make the biggest difference when everything is on the line. The family tradition that began everything started in March 1918, when Marine Corporal Patrick O'Sullivan found a penny lying in the mud of a French battlefield during the final German offensive of World War I. Patrick was 19 years old, a tough Irish kid from Boston's South Shore who had enlisted to fight the Kaiser's army and prove that Irish Americans were as patriotic as any other ethnic group in America. Patrick had grown up in a 3-story tenement building in South Boston, where his father worked as a longshoreman on the docks and his mother took in laundry to help support their family of 6 children. The O'Sullivan family had immigrated from County Cork during the potato famine of the 1840s, and Patrick's generation was the first to be born as American citizens with all the rights and responsibilities that citizenship entailed. The penny that Patrick picked up was dated 1901, making it 17 years old and worn smooth from years of circulation through countless hands and pockets. The copper had turned dark brown with age and handling, and Abraham Lincoln's profile was barely visible after years of wear and oxidation. Patrick had been carrying it for only 3 days when his unit came under intense German machine gun fire during the Battle of Belleau Wood. The battle was one of the most vicious encounters between American and German forces during the final months of World War I. Patrick's Marine unit was advancing through dense woodland when they encountered a German machine gun nest that had been positioned to command the approaches to a strategic road junction. The German gunners were veteran soldiers who had been fighting on the Western Front since 1914, and they operated their weapons with the mechanical precision that came from years of combat experience. Patrick's squad was caught in the open when the German machine gun opened fire, cutting down 3 Marines in the first burst and forcing the survivors to take cover behind fallen logs and shell craters. The German bullet that struck Patrick's chest had been fired from a range of less than 200 yards, giving it enough velocity to penetrate standard military equipment and cause fatal injuries to anyone it hit directly. But the penny in Patrick's breast pocket stopped the bullet fragment that would have penetrated his heart and killed him instantly. The German round had struck Patrick's chest with enough force to knock him unconscious and leave a permanent bruise, but the penny had absorbed just enough of the impact to prevent fatal penetration. The bullet had flattened against the penny and created a small dent that would serve as permanent proof of its life-saving intervention. When Patrick regained consciousness in a field hospital 3 hours later, he found the penny in his torn shirt pocket, now bearing the distinctive mark that would become part of O'Sullivan family folklore for generations to come. The Navy chaplain who visited Patrick during his recovery told him that survival like his was evidence of divine protection, but Patrick understood that his survival had been the result of both luck and the penny that had been in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. Patrick kept the penny for the rest of his military service, carrying it through the final battles of World War I and bringing it home to Boston when the war ended in November 1918. He married his childhood sweetheart Margaret Flanagan in a ceremony at St. Bridget's Church in 1920, and when their son Michael was born in 1921, Patrick began telling the boy stories about the penny that had saved his father's life and brought him home safely from the war in Europe. "This penny's got magic in it, Mickey," Patrick would tell his son during bedtime stories that mixed Irish folklore with genuine battlefield experience. "It's been blessed by the luck of the Irish and the courage of American fighting men. Someday, when you're old enough, it'll be yours to carry, and it'll keep you safe just like it kept your old man safe in France." Michael O'Sullivan grew up believing in the penny's protective power, not because he was superstitious but because he had seen how his father's confidence in the penny translated into confidence in himself. Patrick carried the penny during his work as a Boston police officer, and he credited it with helping him survive 23 years of walking dangerous beats in neighborhoods where cops were often targets for criminals who had nothing to lose. The penny's second test came in 1934, when Michael was working in a Boston shipyard during the worst years of the Great Depression and a crane cable snapped while he was loading steel plates onto a cargo vessel. The massive steel beam that fell should have crushed Michael instantly, but it struck the penny in his shirt pocket first, changing the angle of impact just enough to send the beam crashing to the ground beside him instead of directly onto his head. The accident occurred on a gray October morning when Michael was working with a crew of 12 men to load steel plates onto the cargo ship, Boston Pride, a vessel that was being prepared for a freight run to Liverpool. The work was dangerous and physically demanding, requiring precise coordination between crane operators and dock workers who guided the heavy steel plates into position using hand signals and shouted instructions. Michael had been working at the shipyard for 8 years, ever since he graduated from high school and needed steady employment to support his wife Catherine and their young son Danny. The job paid better than most work available during the Depression, but it also carried risks that claimed the lives of several workers every year through industrial accidents that were considered an unavoidable part of heavy construction work. The crane that was lifting the steel plates was a massive piece of equipment that had been built in 1919 and was showing signs of wear and metal fatigue that made it increasingly unreliable. The cable that snapped had been inspected just 2 weeks earlier and certified as safe for continued use, but the daily stress of lifting multi-ton loads had weakened the steel strands beyond their breaking point. When the cable snapped, the steel beam it was supporting fell from a height of 40 feet, gaining tremendous speed and momentum as it plummeted toward the dock where Michael and his crew were working. The beam weighed over 3 tons and was falling with enough force to kill anyone it struck directly, while also threatening to cause secondary damage to equipment and other workers in the immediate area. Michael had less than 2 seconds to react when he heard the distinctive sound of snapping cable and looked up to see the massive steel beam falling directly toward his position. Most men would have frozen in terror or attempted to run in a direction that would have put them directly in the path of the falling beam, but Michael had been trained by his father to stay calm under pressure and look for opportunities that other people might miss. Instead of running away from the falling beam, Michael dove toward a stack of lumber that provided partial protection while putting him in a position where the beam's impact would be absorbed by the wooden planks rather than his body. But even with his quick thinking and evasive action, Michael would have been killed if the beam had maintained its original trajectory toward his chest. The beam struck the penny in Michael's shirt pocket with tremendous force, creating a loud metallic clang that could be heard throughout the shipyard. The impact was powerful enough to drive the penny through Michael's shirt and embed it temporarily in his chest, but it also changed the beam's angle of fall by just enough to send it crashing into the lumber stack instead of crushing Michael's body. Michael emerged from the accident with a dislocated shoulder, 3 cracked ribs, and a penny that now bore 2 dents, one from his father's war and one from his own near-death experience. The shipyard foreman called it the luckiest escape he'd seen in 30 years of construction work, but Michael knew it was more than luck. It was the continuation of a family tradition that connected him to his father's courage and his own responsibility to pass that courage on to the next generation. When Michael's son Danny was born in 1922, the penny became part of the boy's education in O'Sullivan family history and the values that had kept 3 generations of O'Sullivan men alive through war, economic hardship, and industrial accidents that claimed the lives of men who didn't have the benefit of family traditions that taught them to be prepared for anything. Danny O'Sullivan grew up hearing stories about his grandfather's service in France and his father's close call in the shipyard, and by the time he was old enough to understand the significance of family traditions, he was also old enough to understand that the penny represented something more important than supernatural protection. It represented the accumulated wisdom, courage, and preparedness of O'Sullivan men who had faced danger and survived through a combination of skill, determination, and the confidence that came from knowing they were part of something larger than themselves. When Danny enlisted in the Army Air Forces in December 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor, his father Michael gave him the penny along with instructions that had been passed down from grandfather to son: carry it close to your heart, never let it out of your sight, and remember that luck favors the prepared. The penny won't save you by magic, it'll save you by reminding you to stay alert, stay ready, and never give up when things look impossible. Danny had been carrying the penny for 18 months when he found himself locked in combat with some of the most experienced and deadly fighter pilots in the Japanese Imperial Navy over the Solomon Islands in July 1943. The mission that brought Danny face-to-face with death began at 0630 hours on July 15, 1943, when his P-38 Lightning took off from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal as part of a fighter sweep designed to clear Japanese aircraft from the approaches to Bougainville Island. Danny was flying his 37th combat mission as a member of the 339th Fighter Squadron, and he had already shot down 4 Japanese aircraft while establishing a reputation as one of the most aggressive and effective pilots in his unit. The briefing for the mission had taken place at 0500 hours in the squadron's operations tent, where intelligence officers had warned the pilots about increased Japanese fighter activity in the Northern Solomons and the possibility of encountering experienced enemy pilots who were being transferred from the carriers that had been damaged during recent naval battles. Danny's flight leader was Captain Robert "Hawk" Morrison, a veteran pilot with 12 confirmed kills who had been flying combat missions since the early days of the Guadalcanal campaign. Morrison's experience and tactical knowledge had kept his flight alive through some of the most dangerous missions in the Pacific Theater, and Danny had learned more about air combat from Morrison than from any formal training program. Intelligence thinks the Japanese are moving experienced pilots south from Rabaul, Morrison had told the flight during the mission briefing. That means we might be facing some of their best people today, so stay alert and don't take any unnecessary risks. Stick together, watch each other's backs, and remember that getting home alive is more important than individual kill scores. The P-38 Lightning that Danny was flying was a twin-engine, twin-boom fighter that had been designed specifically for long-range missions in the Pacific Theater. Danny's aircraft was named Boston Irish, in honor of his family heritage, and it bore the distinctive nose art of a shamrock surrounded by machine gun bullets that had been painted by the squadron's crew chief. The aircraft's twin Allison V-1710 engines provided 1,425 horsepower each, giving the Lightning a top speed of over 400 miles per hour and a service ceiling of 44,000 feet. The distinctive twin-boom configuration made the P-38 one of the most recognizable aircraft in the Pacific, but it also made it a priority target for Japanese pilots who understood that destroying experienced American pilots was more important than shooting down individual aircraft. Danny's Lightning was equipped with 4.50 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon concentrated in the nose, giving it devastating firepower in head-on attacks but requiring precise aim and careful ammunition management during extended combat. The aircraft's twin engines provided reliability and redundancy that were essential for survival in the vast distances of Pacific air combat, but they also made the plane heavier and less maneuverable than single-engine fighters like the Japanese Zero. The flight to the target area took 45 minutes, during which Danny's formation maintained radio silence while flying at 15,000 feet through scattered cloud cover that provided concealment from Japanese observation posts on the islands below. The morning sun was beginning to create the kind of lighting conditions that could be either an advantage or a disadvantage depending on how pilots positioned themselves relative to enemy aircraft. As the formation approached the coordinates where intelligence had predicted they would encounter Japanese fighters, Danny could feel the familiar combination of excitement and anxiety that preceded every combat engagement. He checked his weapon systems, adjusted his harness and oxygen mask, and touched the penny in his breast pocket that had become part of his pre-combat ritual. The tactical situation that Danny encountered over the Solomons was more challenging than intelligence reports had predicted. Instead of the small fighter patrol that American commanders expected to encounter, Danny's formation ran into a full squadron of Japanese A-6M0 fighters led by some of the most experienced pilots in the Imperial Navy Air Service. The Japanese formation was commanded by Lieutenant Commander Saburo Yamamoto, a veteran pilot with over 20 confirmed victories who had been fighting American aircraft since the attack on Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto's Zero bore the distinctive markings of an ace pilot and was equipped with the latest modifications that made it faster and more maneuverable than earlier versions of the aircraft. But Yamamoto was also flying with a personal grudge against American pilots who had been systematically destroying Japanese air superiority throughout the Solomon Islands campaign. His younger brother had been shot down by an American P-38 3 weeks earlier, and Yamamoto was determined to avenge his family's honor by destroying as many American fighters as possible. The engagement began at 0847 hours when Danny's formation encountered Yamamoto's Zeros at 15,000 feet over the waters between Guadalcanal and New Georgia. The initial contact was a classic Pacific air battle, high-speed passes, vertical maneuvers, and split-second timing that separated experienced pilots from those who were flying their first combat missions. The Japanese formation was flying in a loose Vic formation that allowed individual pilots maximum maneuverability while maintaining mutual support against American attacks. Yamamoto's tactical doctrine emphasized the Zero's superior turning ability and climb rate, using these advantages to force American pilots into turning fights where Japanese aircraft could outmaneuver their heavier opponents. Danny's flight responded to the Japanese attack using tactics that had been developed specifically for P-38 operations against Zero fighters. Instead of trying to outmaneuver the Japanese aircraft in turning fights, the American pilots used their superior speed and diving ability to make high-speed passes that minimized their exposure to Japanese defensive fire while maximizing their opportunities to score hits with concentrated firepower. Danny scored his first hits of the engagement during a diving attack on a Japanese Zero that was attempting to climb after Captain Morrison's Lightning. Danny's 20mm cannon round struck the Zero's engine cowling and caused immediate white smoke that indicated coolant system damage, but the Japanese pilot managed to continue flying and maneuvering despite the damage to his aircraft. The second phase of the engagement became a series of individual dogfights as the formations broke up and pilots found themselves engaged in one-on-one combat that tested their individual skills and aircraft capabilities. Danny found himself pursuing a Japanese Zero in a climbing spiral that rapidly gained altitude while both pilots tried to position themselves for killing shots. The Japanese pilot that Danny was fighting demonstrated the kind of skill and experience that came from years of combat operations throughout the Pacific theater. The Zero's superior climb rate allowed it to gain altitude faster than Danny's Lightning, while its tighter turning radius made it difficult for Danny to maintain a firing position during the spiraling climb. But Danny had learned from Captain Morrison and other experienced pilots that victory in air combat often depended more on patience and tactical thinking than on aggressive maneuvering that could lead to fatal mistakes. Instead of trying to match the Zero's climbing performance, Danny used his aircraft's superior speed to build energy that could be converted into altitude or position when the tactical situation provided an opportunity. The opportunity came when the Japanese pilot made the mistake of trying to reverse his climb into a diving attack, a maneuver that required him to present his aircraft's profile to Danny's guns for several seconds while transitioning from climbing to diving flight. Danny's burst of .50 caliber machine gun fire caught the Zero during this vulnerable moment, causing visible damage to the aircraft's wing and fuselage. But Danny also found himself separated from his formation and facing multiple Japanese aircraft that were coordinating their attacks with the kind of precision that came from years of combat experience and absolute confidence in their equipment and tactics. Two more Zeros had positioned themselves to attack Danny from different angles, creating a tactical situation where any evasive maneuver against one aircraft would expose him to attack from another. The critical moment came when Danny's P-38 was engaged by three Japanese Zeros simultaneously, forcing him into a defensive spiral that rapidly depleted his altitude and airspeed while the Japanese pilots used their superior maneuverability to close in for killing shots from multiple angles. Danny could see the Japanese pilots coordinating their attacks through hand signals and formation positioning that demonstrated their experience working together as a team. Danny's situation became desperate when one of the attacking Zeros scored hits on his port engine with a burst of 20mm cannon fire that caused immediate damage to the cooling system and reduction in power output. The damaged engine began trailing white smoke and running rough, reducing Danny's Lightning to essentially single-engine performance that made escape from the coordinated Japanese attack extremely difficult. The Japanese pilots recognized that they had trapped a damaged American fighter, and they began closing in for the coordinated attack that would finish Danny's aircraft and add another kill to their impressive records. Yamamoto's Zero was positioning itself for the killing shot while the other two aircraft maintained pressure from different angles to prevent Danny from maneuvering away from the primary attack. But Danny had not survived 36 previous combat missions by giving up when the situation looked hopeless. He had learned from his grandfather's stories about Below Wood and his father's experience in the shipyard that survival often depended on staying calm under pressure and looking for opportunities that other people might miss when they were focused on the obvious threats. The maneuver that changed everything began when Danny noticed that the sun angle was creating visibility problems for the Japanese pilots who were positioning themselves for their final attack. The morning sun was low on the horizon at approximately 30 degrees elevation, creating glare conditions that made it difficult for pilots to see targets that were positioned between their aircraft and the sun's direct rays. Danny had been unconsciously adjusting his position to use the sun glare as concealment, a tactical technique that he had learned from veteran pilots who understood that environmental factors were often more important than mechanical performance in determining the outcome of air combat. The technique required precise positioning that placed the defending aircraft directly between attacking enemies and the sun, but it also required perfect timing to be effective during the brief moments when attacking pilots were vulnerable to sun glare. Danny also remembered his father's instructions about the penny: luck favors the prepared. The penny had never been about supernatural protection or magical intervention. It had been about teaching O'Sullivan men to stay alert for opportunities that other people might miss when they were focused on obvious threats or conventional solutions to tactical problems. As Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto's Zero lined up for the shot that would destroy Danny's crippled P-38, Danny made a calculated movement that positioned his aircraft so that the penny in his breast pocket would catch the morning sunlight and reflect it directly toward the Japanese pilot's cockpit. The maneuver was deliberate and precisely timed, but it also required Danny to maintain his position long enough for the reflection to occur while also preparing for the evasive action that would either save his life or send him into an uncontrollable dive. The reflection occurred at exactly 0854 hours when the angle between Danny's aircraft, the sun, and Yamamoto's Zero created the geometric conditions necessary for the penny to act as a signal mirror. The flash of reflected sunlight was brief but intensely bright, lasting for approximately 2 seconds and occurring at exactly the moment when Yamamoto was making final adjustments to his aim before firing his 20mm cannon. The blinding flash of reflected sunlight struck Yamamoto's eyes just as he was squeezing the trigger, causing an involuntary flinch that pulled his aim approximately 6 inches to the left of Danny's cockpit. The Japanese pilot's reaction was immediate and instinctive, a protective response to sudden bright light that momentarily disrupted his vision and muscle control at the critical moment when precision was essential for a successful kill. Yamamoto's 20mm cannon rounds passed through the space where Danny's fuel tank was located, missing the critical aircraft systems by the narrowest possible margin while giving Danny the split second he needed to execute the evasive maneuver that he had been preparing throughout the final approach. The cannon shells continued past Danny's aircraft and exploded harmlessly in the air several hundred yards away, their orange fireballs marking the location where Danny should have died. Danny's response to Yamamoto's missed shot was instantaneous and perfectly executed, demonstrating the kind of preparation and training that had kept him alive through 36 previous combat missions. Instead of trying to climb or turn away from the Japanese attack, Danny rolled his damaged P-38 into a diving spiral that used gravity and his remaining engine power to build speed while making his aircraft a difficult target for the pursuing Japanese fighters. The diving spiral was a dangerous maneuver that required precise control and perfect timing to avoid entering an unrecoverable dive that would end in impact with the ocean 15,000 feet below. Danny had practiced this exact maneuver dozens of times during training, and he understood how to use his aircraft's weight and momentum to build energy that could be converted into altitude or speed when the tactical situation required rapid movement. The maneuver also took advantage of the P-38's superior diving speed and structural strength compared to the lighter Japanese fighters that were pursuing him. While the Zeros were faster and more maneuverable in level flight and climbing, the Lightning's heavier construction and more powerful engines gave it significant advantages in high-speed dives that Japanese pilots were reluctant to match due to structural limitations in their aircraft. As Danny's Lightning dove toward the ocean at increasing speed, the Japanese pilots found themselves in the difficult position of having to follow their target into a high-speed dive while maintaining formation and avoiding collision with each other. The tactical advantage shifted from the Japanese hunters to the American prey as Danny used his superior diving speed and structural strength to separate himself from his pursuers. The diving spiral was a dangerous maneuver that required precise control and perfect timing to avoid entering an unrecoverable dive that would end in impact with the ocean. But Danny had practiced this exact maneuver dozens of times during training, and he understood how to use his aircraft's weight and momentum to build energy that could be converted into altitude or speed when the tactical situation required rapid movement. As Danny's Lightning dove toward the ocean at increasing speed, the Japanese pilots found themselves in the difficult position of having to follow their target into a high-speed dive while maintaining formation and avoiding collision with each other. The tactical advantage shifted from the Japanese hunters to the American prey as Danny used his superior diving speed and structural strength to separate himself from his pursuers. The chase that followed lasted 7 minutes and covered 20 miles of Pacific Ocean as Danny used every technique he had learned about energy management, tactical maneuvering, and psychological warfare to outfight Japanese pilots who had more experience and better aircraft but who had been demoralized by missing what should have been an easy kill. Danny's escape was completed when he managed to reach cloud cover at low altitude, using the concealment to break visual contact with the pursuing Japanese fighters and navigate back toward American-controlled airspace. By the time the Japanese pilots realized that their quarry had escaped, Danny was already heading home to Henderson Field with a story that would become legendary among American pilots who understood how close he had come to death. But Danny's survival was more than just good fortune or skillful flying. It was the culmination of 3 generations of O'Sullivan family tradition that had taught him to stay calm under pressure, look for opportunities that other people might miss, and never give up when survival depended on doing the impossible. The landing that completed the miracle occurred at 0931 hours when Danny's damaged P-38 touched down on Henderson Field's steel mat runway with one engine smoking and structural damage that made the aircraft barely controllable. The ground crew that met Danny's aircraft was amazed that he had managed to fly the damaged fighter home, and the intelligence officers who debriefed him were fascinated by his account of using reflected sunlight to disrupt a Japanese pilot's aim at the critical moment. "You're telling me that a penny in your pocket saved your life?" asked Major Robert Harrison, the squadron intelligence officer who was documenting Danny's combat report. "I'm telling you that my grandfather's penny reminded me to stay alert and look for any advantage I could find," Danny replied. "The reflection might have been accidental, but positioning myself to use the sun was deliberate. The penny didn't save me by magic, it saved me by reminding me to think like an O'Sullivan." Major Harrison's report of Danny's escape became part of the tactical intelligence that was distributed to other American fighter pilots, emphasizing the importance of using environmental factors like sun angle and weather conditions to create tactical advantages against enemy aircraft. But for Danny, the most important aspect of his survival was the confirmation that his family's tradition of courage and preparedness had once again proven its value under the most extreme circumstances. The penny that had saved Danny's life now bore 3 dents, one from his grandfather's war, one from his father's industrial accident, and one from Danny's own brush with death at 15,000 feet over the Solomon Sea. Each dent represented a moment when an O'Sullivan man had faced death and survived through a combination of family tradition, personal skill, and the kind of luck that comes to people who are prepared for anything. Danny's squadron mates began calling him Lucky O'Sullivan after word of his escape spread through the fighter community, but Danny understood that his survival had been the result of more than luck. It had been the product of 3 generations of family wisdom that taught him to stay calm under pressure, look for opportunities that other people might miss, and never give up when survival depended on refusing to accept defeat. The psychological impact of Danny's escape extended beyond his personal survival to influence the morale and tactical thinking of other American pilots who were facing the same life-and-death struggles against experienced Japanese opponents. Danny's story demonstrated that even the most desperate situations could be turned into opportunities for survival when pilots remained calm and used every available resource to their advantage. But perhaps most importantly, Danny's experience proved that family traditions could provide more than emotional support during wartime. They could provide practical advantages that made the difference between life and death when everything depended on split-second decision-making and the confidence to attempt maneuvers that other pilots might consider too dangerous to try. The tradition that continued through victory began when Danny returned to the United States in late 1943 after completing his tour of combat duty in the Pacific Theater. He had flown 57 combat missions, shot down 9 Japanese aircraft, and survived encounters that had killed many other experienced pilots who didn't have the benefit of family traditions that taught them to stay prepared for anything. Danny's homecoming was celebrated throughout South Boston, where the O'Sullivan family was well known and respected for their contributions to the community and their military service in 2 world wars. Danny was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his combat record and his survival against overwhelming odds, but the medal that meant the most to him was the simple acknowledgement from his father that he had lived up to the family tradition of courage and preparedness. Danny brought the penny home to Boston, where his father Michael was working in the same shipyard where he had nearly been killed 9 years earlier. The reunion between father and son was emotional and profound, representing not just the survival of another family member but the continuation of a tradition that had now proven its value in 3 different wars and conflicts. The penny did its job again, Danny told his father as he showed him the new dent that had been added during his combat tour. But I want you to know that it wasn't the penny that saved me, it was everything you and grandfather taught me about staying alert, staying ready, and never giving up when people are counting on you to come home. Michael O'Sullivan understood exactly what his son meant. The penny had never been about supernatural protection or magical intervention. It had been about teaching O'Sullivan men to carry themselves with confidence, to look for opportunities that other people might miss, and to remember that they were part of a family tradition that had survived every challenge by refusing to accept defeat. Danny married his childhood sweetheart, Mary Catherine Flanagan, in a ceremony at St. Bridget's Church in 1944. The wedding was attended by over 200 people from the South Boston Irish community, including several of Danny's squadron mates who had survived their own tours of combat duty in the Pacific Theater. The wedding reception featured traditional Irish music and dancing, but also included stories about the O'Sullivan family penny and its role in keeping 3 generations of O'Sullivan men alive through wars and industrial accidents. When their son Patrick was born in 1946, the penny became part of the next generation's education in O'Sullivan family values and the principles that had kept their fathers and grandfathers alive through wars, accidents, and economic hardships that had defeated other men who didn't have the benefit of family traditions that taught them to be prepared for anything. Patrick O'Sullivan grew up during the early years of the Cold War, when American military forces were engaged in conflicts around the world and the threat of nuclear war created new challenges for military families who understood that their sons might be called upon to serve in even more dangerous conflicts than their fathers had faced. The Korean War tested the penny's power once again when Patrick O'Sullivan carried it as a Marine Corps pilot flying F-4U Corsairs against Chinese and North Korean forces during some of the most intense air combat of the conflict. Patrick's close call came during a ground attack mission when anti-aircraft fire damaged his aircraft and forced him to make an emergency landing behind enemy lines, where he spent 3 days evading capture while making his way back to American positions. Patrick's survival during those 3 days depended not on reflected sunlight or deflected bullets, but on the family tradition of staying calm under pressure, using available resources creatively, and never giving up when survival depended on determination and ingenuity. Patrick used techniques that his father and grandfather had taught him about observing his environment, staying alert for opportunities, and maintaining the confidence necessary to attempt dangerous actions when conventional approaches were inadequate. The Vietnam War added another dent to the penny when Patrick's son Michael carried it as a helicopter pilot flying medical evacuation missions in the Mekong Delta during the most intense period of American involvement in Southeast Asia. Michael's survival depended not on battlefield luck but on the family tradition of staying calm under pressure and looking for landing zones that other pilots might consider too dangerous to attempt when wounded soldiers needed immediate evacuation. Michael's most dangerous mission occurred when he was forced to land his UH-1 Huey helicopter in a rice paddy that was under enemy fire in order to evacuate a wounded Marine who would have died without immediate medical attention. The landing required precise flying skills and the kind of courage that came from understanding that some risks were worth taking when other people's lives depended on your willingness to attempt the impossible. Each generation of O'Sullivan men had faced different challenges and different enemies, but they had all survived by applying the same fundamental principles that Patrick had learned in the trenches of France: stay alert, stay ready, and never give up when people are counting on your survival. The penny itself was just a piece of metal, but the family tradition it represented had created a legacy of survival and success that continued to benefit O'Sullivan descendants long after the original dangers had passed. The legacy that outlasted the wars extended far beyond the O'Sullivan family to influence the broader understanding of how family traditions and personal confidence could provide practical advantages in life-and-death situations. Danny's story became part of the military folklore that was passed down through generations of American fighter pilots who understood that survival often depended on psychological factors as much as technical skills or superior equipment. The penny itself became a symbol of the connection between family tradition and individual courage, demonstrating how parents and grandparents could provide their children with advantages that couldn't be measured in terms of money or material resources but that could make the difference between life and death when everything was on the line. Danny's combat reports were studied by military psychologists who were interested in understanding how family traditions and personal confidence affected pilot performance under extreme stress. His experience demonstrated that pilots who believed in their own survival were more likely to remain calm under pressure and make the kind of split-second decisions that could turn desperate situations into opportunities for escape and victory. But the most important legacy of Danny's story was the demonstration that family traditions could provide practical benefits that extended far beyond emotional support or psychological comfort. The O'Sullivan family penny had taught 3 generations of men to carry themselves with confidence, to look for opportunities that other people might miss, and to never give up when survival depended on refusing to accept defeat. The values that the penny represented, preparation, alertness, courage, and persistence, proved effective in every situation where O'Sullivan men had faced mortal danger. The penny itself was just a piece of metal, but the family tradition it represented had created a legacy of survival and success that continued to benefit O'Sullivan descendants long after the original dangers had passed. So here's the question Danny's story poses: what family traditions do you carry that might provide practical advantages in difficult situations? How do the values and wisdom that were passed down from your parents and grandparents influence your ability to stay calm under pressure and look for opportunities that other people might miss? And what traditions will you pass on to the next generation that might someday make the difference between their success and failure when everything important is on the line? Danny O'Sullivan proved that sometimes the most powerful weapons are not made of steel or explosive but of family tradition, personal confidence, and the accumulated wisdom of generations who survived by refusing to give up when survival depended on doing whatever it took to get home alive to the people who were counting on them.